And this book talks a lot about encantados and orishas, isn't it? Um, yeah, Itamar, tell us a bit about this world and also about how this story came to you. Um, because I believe this story had been with you for a long time before you write. It always happens like this, isn't it? We don't just write a book.
Sim.
The writing the book is always the end of a long process that happens somewhere back there. So yeah, tell us a bit about that process.
Ah, foi um processo bem interessante,
Well, it was
Gabriela.
quite an interesting process, Gabriela. As you were speaking, I was recalling,
Bom, éramos crianças, eu era
well, when
criança,
we were kids, when I was a
a gente vivia
child,
numa
and I
casa,
lived in a
uma
house
família simples,
with
tinha muitas
from a humble family.
famílias no Brasil, no Nordeste,
Families
a
in
gente
Brazil and in the
vivia
northeast of
algo
Brazil, especially in the
eu venho
northeast
da
of Brazil,
Bahia,
and I am from the state of Bahia, that's where I
famílias têm
live,
muito forte
families
vínculo
have a
com a
very
família. O
strong
núcleo familiar não é
connection.
apenas o pai, a
So
mãe
the core of the
e
family is not just the
os
father, the mother, and the
primos, os
children. You know, there
tios.
are cousins involved, uncles,
E eu
aunts,
lembro que
grandparents, great grandparents.
quando eu tinha
When I
uns
was
7
about,
8
when I
anos
wanted to
e
know
não existia
something,
uma explicação
and there was no explanation,
racional
no
para
rational
explicar,
explanation or
eu
scientific explanation for
dava
that,
aquilo ao mágico,
that
ao mundo
was
mágico,
attributed
o
to magic,
sacro,
to the
né, como a gente
domain
diz.
of magic
Ou
or of sacred,
seja,
because God
eu
wants
acho
it to
que
happen.
é uma maneira muito particular,
So I think it's a very particular
muito própria de
way, a
ver o
very
mundo desde sempre,
specific
né?
perspective
E
of the
eu,
world when
antes de
seen from
chegar, eu
that
sempre
place.
fui
Years
leitor,
later,
sempre escrevi.
I was always a reader and I
Talvez
always wrote,
escrever tenha sido
and maybe writing
a minha primeira paixão, né?
was my
Descobri
first
assim,
passion, the
sem
first
querer,
passion
porque foi a minha
that I
primeira,
discovered for me,
foram as minhas
reading
primeiras
and writing,
paixões.
my first
E
two passions.
eu teve um momento já
There
que eu
was a
não tinha uma
moment.
orientação
Well,
de uma
I
de
didn't
como
have any
tinha
guidance
que
when I
ler,
read from an adult because there
mas
were no
eu
readers in my
eu estava
household.
no já no
But I
ensino
remember
médio,
when I was in high school,
quando
ensino
o
médio,
médio
in Brazil.
é o ensino, os três últimos
Ensino
anos
médio
do
are the
ensino
3 last
básico, né,
years
que nós
of
temos
basic education before you go
aqui no
to
Brasil.
university.
Eu tive contato com uma professora de
And at that
literatura,
time, I had a
professora
literature
Terezinha
teacher,
Cioli, e ela me
Professora
apresentou
Terezinha
a literatura
Ascioli.
escrita no
And
Brasil, a
she
primeira metade
introduced
do
me
século
to literature
XX,
from the first half of the
né?
20th
O
century in
Johnny
Brazil.
falou do Jorge
And
Jorge
Johnny
Amado,
mentioned
mas
Jorge Amado,
eu lembro do Graciliano
and I
Ramos,
remember
José
Graciliano
Lins de
Ramos, José Lins do
Raquel de
Rego,
Queiroz,
Raquel de
do Guimarães
Queiroz,
Rosa, foram alguns
Guimarães
autores
Rosa. These
da
were
minha vida e
authors
eu li assim
that were part of my
num
universe.
fôlego,
And I read them
e
in one single
eu me lembro que
breath
foi
at the
exatamente nesse
time.
momento, eu deveria ter uns
And
16
it
anos,
was
essa
right there. I
história
was about
se
16.
não com a
That's when this story, of
complexidade, não
course,
com a
not with the same
magnitude que ela
complexity,
teve
not with the
depois,
same magnitude
de
that it
certa
acquired
forma,
later on.
de
But that's when
seguir
this
uma
story came
carreira.
to me. How did it come to
Eu
me, this
queria
story?
contar uma história
I
de
wanted
duas
to
irmãs
tell the story of two
que
sisters
viviam numa
who
propriedade
lived
rural, viviam num
in a rural
sítio.
area, in a small rural farm.
A história tinha falava da relação
And the
entre as duas
story
por período
was
longo de
about
suas
their relationship
vidas
throughout a
e
long
também
period of
com
their
o
lives.
pai,
But
né?
it was also a story of their relationship
Elas
to their
não
father.
tinham estes nomes
Of
e
course, they didn't
eu
have
queria
these
dizer
names,
então
and I remember I
essa
even wrote
história
80
e
pages
com
of this
16
story.
anos
But at the age
não
of
vai muito
16,
longe, né?
we don't go too far, right?
Era uma tentativa,
It was
enfim,
an
mas
attempt,
valeu.
but it was worth it.
E depois eu perdi essas páginas,
And then I
não
lost these
não
pages.
encontrei
I
novamente,
never
não sei
found
se
them
se
again.
perderam numa
I
mudança,
think they
mas
got
eu
lost when
sempre
I
tive
moved
o
to a
desejo
different
de
house.
contar essa
But
história,
I
de
always
contar essa
had the
história.
desire of telling the
E
story.
anos depois, eu já com 25
Years
anos, eu
later, when I
comecei a
was about
trabalhar
25,
no serviço
I
público
started
no
working
Recife
as a civil
e
servant in
não foi por
Brazil.
escolha que eu fui
It was
trabalhar. Eu
not by
precisava de
choice. I
trabalho depois que
needed
eu me
work. I
formei
needed to
como
work after I graduated from
geógrafo.
university. I
E
have a
fui
background in
trabalhar no
geography.
serviço
That's my
público porque a
academic
casa
background.
era no
And I
campo.
went to work
E
as
quando
a
eu
civil
cheguei
servant,
no
and I
no
did work out
Brasil,
in the
quando
field,
eu cheguei
in the
no Brasil, eu fui
countryside of
trabalhar no
Brazil.
estado do Maranhão, não foi na
I
Bahia.
went to work in another
Depois
state,
eu
state of
voltei
Maranhão.
para Bahia.
And then I came back to Bahia years later. But when I went to work in the state of Maranhão and I was out in the field, in the countryside, I was
Bom, muito tempo
perplexed.
havia se passado
a lot of time had gone by since these works I mentioned had been published. They had been written 60, 70 years earlier, 80 years earlier, or from now, right? If we consider almost 80 years since Vidas Secas from Graciliano Ramos. And the countryside, the field in Brazil was just like it was described in those stories. And I was shocked. It's as if time stood still. And I always had the desire, but this desire became stronger at the time to write the story. I would only get to write it years later, because I decided to follow a different path before that. So I was working, I did my master's, my PhD, and literature always found a room in my life. But I needed to do that before I completely gave myself to literature, because I needed more qualifications. I needed to work, I had to work. Life was always difficult for most of the Brazilian population. And I held on to this opportunity to keep on studying. But I always had the desire of writing the story. And that's, when I went out in the field, because before that, the countryside was part of my family memories of my ancestors, because I hadn't lived in the countryside myself. And this experience was decisive for me to write the story the way it is, with these characters, with this narrative, with this magic element, or these magic elements, or Jare and these beliefs. It was only possible because I went out to work as a civil servant in the field.
Yeah,